The latest poll, it's an Ipsos poll. Tell us about it.
It's an MRP poll, so it's one of the big ones that looks at the seats, and it's putting Labour on course for a landslide, winning 453 seats to the Conservatives winning 115. That would give Keir Starmer a majority of 256. In the House of Commons. It would be the worst ever defeat for the Conservatives. Running through the smaller parties, the Liberal Democrats would win 38 seats under this projection, the SNP 15, 3 for the Greens and 3 for Reform UK, including Nigel Farage entering the House of Commons. But Jeremy Corbyn would lose. He's standing as an independent and he would lose his seat. He would no longer be an MP. So just on vote share, because I know some people will be looking at these numbers as well. These are Labour would have an implied vote share, according to Ipsos of 43%, the Tories on 25%, and Reform UK down on 12%, the Lib Dems on 10%, Greens 6%, SNP 3%, and Plaid Cymru on 1%. And according to this projection, this is a 15% swing away from the Conservatives' Tory vote in 2019. But there is some hope potentially in this poll for the Conservatives, because it finds that there are 117 seats. That's the majority of which were won by the Tories back in 2019, which Ipsos are saying are too close to call because they have a winning margin of less than 5 percentage points, and they include 56 where the Tories are marginally ahead and 48 where Labour is slightly in the lead. So although compared to previous MRP polls, which put Labour, the margin between Labour and the Tories at an even greater extent. One MRP poll put the Tories down on something between 65 and 72 seats in the House of Commons. It could get worse. It could get better. So Ipsos are factoring that in as well.
All right. So there is a battlefield still to be
There's
contested.
a battle still to be contested.
But the raw number, the raw prediction of a majority for Labour of 256 seats. That is what 50 seats, that's 70 seats more than the 1997
yes, and it's the
thumping.
Yes, so Blair won a majority of 179 back in 1997, so it's significantly larger than that. It's a 15% swing away from the Tories. It would be, a seismic event, but perhaps not quite the extinction level event that has previously been talked about, where the Tories could even be pushed into third place and Sir Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, suddenly becomes the leader of the opposition. So it's not quite on that scale. This is slightly more encouraging compared to the predictions of catastrophe for the Conservatives that other polls have done.
Yeah, and clearly the Conservative Party feeling the effects of reform snatching their votes away. Although this poll doesn't suggest that fight, Tory reform, is as close as some other polls have suggested.
Yes, just to go over that number again. So previous polls, there was a YouGov poll, of course, out last week, which gave the Reform, Nigel Farage's Reform, a 1-point lead. Actually, the gap here between the Tories on 25 points and Reform down on 12 points, that's more encouraging for the Conservatives.
Right, let's look at the day's campaigning. We've had Rishi Sunak welcoming Boris Johnson's involvement on the fringe at this stage of the campaign, writing, or as it were, processing thousands of letters and a number of video messages. He says that's going to make a difference. Interesting, that, isn't it? There's an edge in that relationship. The fact is that's in the background.
Yes, I think it's interesting that Boris Johnson has decided to come in at this particular juncture of the campaign, where over halfway through, he has always been the man to deliver election results for the Conservatives. He's got an incredible election when it comes to winning. He won in London in 2008, London in 2012, and of course that huge majority of 80 back in 2019.
All right. Theo Usherwood, good to talk to you. Let's talk again very, very soon. What are your thoughts? Well, first of all, we've got the Tories going all in on this danger of an impregnable Labour government after this election and for years to come.
Yes, and this came from Mark Spencer, the former Chief Whip, this morning on Times Radio, where he warned that Keir Starmer could be in power for 20 years. The focus seems to be on this plan that Labour has to give 16 and 17-year-olds the vote. The implication from the Conservatives being that younger voters tend to vote for left-wing parties like Labour. two points to make on this, of course. The counter-accusation from Labour, of course, is that the Tories changed the system to allow to bring in photo ID, which is thought to affect or put off or depress the vote amongst disadvantaged communities, particularly who don't have a photographic ID to hand when they go to the polling stations. Interestingly, actually, Keir Starmer said that Labour would now consult on on that change and could actually make it possible that you don't need voter ID. Again, this would feed into Conservative accusations that Labour are trying to, in effect, gerrymander the vote in order to ensure that they can be in power for a generation. This strategy seems to have taken over now. At the beginning there, we had the original strategy, which was to attack Labour on tax, to attack Keir Starmer on his plans, and then Grant Shapps exclusively revealed this sort of new strategy to go in on this idea of a Labour socialist state with very little room for opposition parties.
Yes.
And it's that now seems to be dominating the Conservative campaign. Rishi Sunak and David Cameron were down in North Devon, where the Tories are facing a challenge from the Liberal Democrats. It's a constituency where they have a 15,000 majority over the Lib Dems, and of course that could be that they're trying to fend that off. And that Lord Cameron polls very well amongst wavering Lib Dem voters, and they actually came into contact with sheep. And they were asked to feed some sheep. Rishi Sunak was asked to feed some sheep, and it didn't go particularly well. So yeah, he didn't have very much luck when he couldn't reach out, when he tried to involve the sheep. They ended up running away from him. It was a bit of a disaster. One of those, perhaps it speaks to the campaign that he's been running, John. A metaphor for the campaign that he has been, trying to galvanise animals, people. Neither are coming along to the Conservative message.
And just a word on Boris Johnson, who's appeared on the radar, back on the radar of this campaign at least.
Yes, I think what's interesting is that the Tories are very, very decisive, actually, and it's a credit to them in this campaign that they know who works with who. So, like I said, Lord Cameron works with Liberal Democrats. Boris Johnson works with those potentially defecting to reform or leaving the Conservatives for reform. Nigel Farage didn't stand in the last election. He didn't reform backed away because the reform decided to back Boris Johnson to get Brexit done and deliver Brexit. This time, of course, they're refusing, the reform of refusing to back down. And that's why Boris Johnson is now coming back into the fray. He's fronting a number of leaflets. He's getting involved with CCHQ and using his name. And I think you're particularly going to see him with candidates in red wall seats, Tory candidates in red wall seats where he is known, where he delivered that 80 seat majority back in 2019. So the Tories are quite decisive. They know what they're doing. They know who appeals to who. Yeah. And whilst it might be Lord Cameron with the Lib Dems, it's Boris Johnson with those reform voters and taking on Nigel Farage.
And Boris Johnson, it maybe should be said, obviously very much a Marmite politician. People like him or very much do not like him. And he's on the fringe of this campaign. He's by no means in the mainstream of this campaign. And when it comes to who he appeals to, we know that a number of those potential defectors to reform and those who have defected to reform, especially in red wall seats, they've got a soft spot for Boris Johnson. But even they are divided. And in the blue wall seats, it's a different story yet again.
And I think what's interesting is you're not just going to see sort of blanket coverage. What the Tories are going to be doing is trying to really ensure that Boris Johnson tags onto those seats which are vulnerable to reform. Where you could see Labour coming, what would otherwise come second, but actually winning the seat because Reform has taken a chunk of the Tory vote. That's where they're going to use Boris Johnson. And of course, he's got his newspaper column as well. But this isn't just a blanket airwaves campaign where Boris Johnson suddenly becomes front and centre. They're going to be using him in specific circumstances to take on Nigel Farage. And you're quite right. Of the last, 15, 20 years, there are only two politicians, Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson, who have that broader appeal. They call them, Heineken politicians. They're the politicians that reach parts of the electorate that other politicians simply have no hope of reaching. They're superstars in their own right. Now, you can disagree with whether you like them or you dislike them, but there is a certain caucus within the electorate that actually they do appeal to, and that's why Boris Johnson has agreed to come on. And of course, there is some bad blood there between Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson. There's a history, isn't there? Because there are many Boris supporters that felt that Rishi Sunak stabbed Boris Johnson in the back with Partygate. They were both fined. Boris Johnson lost his job. Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister. And I think this is a much more of a conservative effort. Rishi Sunak to one side on this. This is about Boris Johnson helping out the Tory party rather than helping out Rishi Sunak.